Thank you so much. What we want to do here is really focus on the part of project management associated with stakeholders. We'll spend some time first context setting around who stakeholders are. We want to then explore what is stakeholder management and when do you use stakeholder management? When do you use those processes? We want to explore where you apply stakeholder management and when, and then why you need to engage in this. Why is it important? Then we're going to shift to investigating how to apply stakeholder management to ensure engagement, which will make a positive difference in your project. So a lot to cover today and in a short period of time. So here we go. So who is a stakeholder? And we'll focus on that first. In its most basic form, a stakeholder is a person with an interest or concern in your project. Stakeholders can be project team members. They can be users that will obtain the benefit of the project, a funding organization, a leader that wants the project outcomes, or interested persons that are unrelated to the project, but they have some kind of interest in your project's success or failure. A key stakeholder or key stakeholders are the person or persons who hold a role when they are not, where they not only define what success looks like, but they also validate at the end of the project that the outcomes of the project are what meets their needs. And I always remind people, project managers, that a successful project at the end, at the outcomes, equals the baseline that you've set with your stakeholders, your key stakeholders, plus all the approved changes throughout the project. That is what leads to successful outcomes. So you add those two things together, and if what your key stakeholders identified as what they wanted at the beginning, plus all the approved changes that you've worked with them, they will feel like they have a successful outcome. So the key stakeholders review the outcomes of the projects along 4 primary dimensions, as I've shown here. First of all, was their experience with the project throughout its implementation favorable or not? Are the results as expected? In other words, the baseline plus the accepted changes. And to what level were the requirements achieved? Were expectations surpassed or deficient? And finally, their perception of the usefulness of the outcomes of the project, was that positive or negative? Do they deem this to be useful or not? I think all of us at some time or another in our careers as project managers have a baseline that they've executed a project to, and at the end of it, it has been overcome by events and the actual project outcomes are not useful. And that is never where you want to end up. Keeping close stakeholder management, actually actively managing stakeholders, can ensure that that actually never happens to you. So that is a good thing if you can make that happen. So if the experience as perceived by the stakeholders favorable, results are as expected, achievement is surpassed, and the perception is that the results are useful, then the key stakeholders will assess the project as a success, and that's where you want to be. So stakeholders also help to convey the vision of what is needed and the level of involvement that they want to maintain throughout the project. So as a project manager, this is your goal, obviously, to provide useful and effective outcomes from your project. And key stakeholders are absolutely critical to that, to meeting that goal. So let's now shift to what a stakeholder is and what stakeholder management is all about. Stakeholder management is the act of applying the processes to capture an image of all the people, all the individuals and organizational entities that can influence, impact, support, detract, inform, and implement a project. It's important in this process to identify all persons or organizations who are impacted by the project and to analyze their needs and their influence. It's important also to engage in a communication strategy that ensures stakeholders are appropriately interacted with so that you can achieve those results you envision. Now, how you communicate with your stakeholders really needs to be planned and executed throughout the entire project. It's not a one and done. You don't identify your stakeholders and then move on and never look back. It is an active engagement with your stakeholders all the way throughout your project. And there's many ways to communicate with stakeholders. So as you plan your communications, it's helpful to consider these dimensions of communications that you might want to assign to different key stakeholders. For example, the level of formality of your communications, the tempo. Is it one time, as needed, ad hoc? Is it more specific? Is the timing real time, or do you need to schedule it out? And then, most importantly, how are you going to transmit? Is it interactive or is it one-way communications? So, how you interact throughout the entire project is very essential to have planned out. Each stakeholder may have a different idea about their ideal communications mechanisms, and meeting their needs around communications will drive goodwill, and it will benefit the project, and it will increase your ability to meet your to actually achieve the outcomes of the project. All right, so let's talk about when you are going to use the stakeholder management processes. So initially, literally as early as possible, it's going to be really critical for you to think through um, in a 360 kind of view, everyone that could potentially be a stakeholder and what their role is. And then throughout the life cycle of the project in every phase to reevaluate that and say, who are my stakeholders? Have they changed? Do I have new stakeholders? Do I need to eliminate some stakeholders because they're not involved in the project? So when you engage stakeholders, also depends on the type of project management method that you're going to use. For example, if you have a very traditional waterfall method project, so for example, you're building widgets that you've built 100 times, you just need to build them and stick to the plan, you're going to have very little stakeholder engagement throughout. It's more going to be informative and not very much interaction, because change as introduced into a waterfall project is typically very costly, and you really don't want to encourage that. Now, conversely, if you are engaged in an agile project or a spiral project, you need to engage your stakeholders at every sprint or at every spiral. You're going to have a much more active stakeholder management engagement in depending on what project management method is used. Regardless of what stakeholder management process is used, you are going to need to regardless of what project management method you're going to use, you will need to engage your stakeholders throughout the project. So we're going to come back and talk about sort of the tools that you can use to manage your stakeholders, but we'll come back to that in a few minutes. What I would like to shift to now is, where do you apply stakeholder management? I find the best way to determine who the key stakeholders are and how they want to be communicated with and how often they want to interact with the project. For me, the best way is to develop a stakeholder management plan and a register. I've shown an example on the previous slide, and I'm going to show an example again in a future slide. But I want to point out that it's important that this plan and register are known as their artifacts of the project and are typically held very closely, as some of the information in compilation is going to be confidential to you. It may not be complimentary. It may, for example, if there's a stakeholder identified that has an intense interest in your project, but has no authority or responsibility, they may want and desire to have face-to-face communications very regularly, but the project manager may deem that it's best to only provide a general summary statement once a quarter. So that will not set well with the stakeholders, that stakeholder, but it might be the right thing for the project. So on the other hand, there might be a risk that if that stakeholder has influence, they could negatively impact the project if they don't get the communication that they desire. So it's important for you to understand that, to document that, and obviously that would be something that you'd want to keep very close hold in the project. The stakeholder plan provides sort of the overarching processes that are going to be used to identify stakeholders, assess their preferred communications, and elicit their requirements, including measures of effectiveness and key performance parameters. So I'll talk about this in a minute, a little bit more, and I'm going to share a graph on that concept in a few slides. The measures of effectiveness, just in case you're not familiar with the term, these are typically a metric used to measure a current system where it's at in your development. So how fast something is, or what the range is, or what the frequency is. These are quantifiable measurements. And for some projects, the key stakeholders have very clear ideas about what their measures of effectiveness, what means effective in their mind. And key performance parameters are typically those things, that these capabilities that the system must meet for it to meet its operational goals set by the user and customer. So, for example, return on investment, return on assets, current ratio between assets and liabilities, or debt to equity ratios are very much key performance parameters that a stakeholder may set and may want you to achieve. Something like the performance of a development technology may very well be established by the key stakeholder, and you'll want to make sure that you understand their needs and requirements. So the stakeholder register is, a spreadsheet, basically, documenting each and every stakeholder, whether they're key or not, and their desired communications of throughout your project. The project team's desired communications, conversely, and all other pertinent information. This information is used to develop and execute the communications management plan to all of these stakeholders. So why should you engage in stakeholder management? Effectively managing stakeholders is a key component of successful project management and should never be ignored. It's important to seize opportunities to utilize support for the project from stakeholders in a position for which they can influence the project or influence users that will obtain the benefits of your project. It's important to mitigate risk to the project associated with a lack of support or resistance from stakeholders. That's essential. And it's important to ensure that all of those individuals who are directly or indirectly affected by the project are engaged in order to optimize the project outcomes. Proper stakeholder management can be used to gain support for a project and anticipate resistance, conflict, or competing objectives among the project stakeholders. And it can also identify where you have overlaps or you have gaps in support from those individuals that are meant to perform on the project. So it's important to run through these stakeholders, including everyone who's supposed to perform on the project. It is going to be an essential step to analyze your approaches to each of these stakeholders to ensure that they are addressed in the best manner for the success of the project. And understanding who your stakeholders are and aligning with their needs will be a major step in ensuring that their feedback counts. Not only does it actually influence the project path, but that they feel engaged and supported, and therefore support your outcomes from the project. So now we want to shift to how you apply stakeholder management. We're getting into the how now of how to do this. And in a few simple steps, stakeholder management can be accomplished, but the act of identifying and analyzing stakeholders can be much more challenging than first thought. So you first need to identify and document the list of all your stakeholders, and you have to get down to the level where it really is going to make sense. A lot of project managers stop at division level. They'll say, well, human resources is a key stakeholder because they need to provide resources. That is not going to be sufficient in order for you to know what that key stakeholder what those communication needs, or how to interact with that entity. So you need to get down to the name of the person in HR that you are going to interface with on everything related to your project. That takes a lot of work to identify and document the list of all stakeholders. But the investment that you make in this now will pay off just so much throughout the project and at the end of the project. Then you need to identify those who are key stakeholders. Those are the ones that really are going to be actively involved in the process of your project. And then you need to fully analyze the stakeholder needs. And you can't do that without their input. That means you need to go talk to everyone that is a key stakeholder in your project. And you need to ask them, how do you want to be communicated with? What role do you see you playing? And then you have to detect from that relationship if those individuals are detractors, if they are supporters, or if they are actively going to work against your goals. And then that information in compilation will help you plan for your communications that you're going to use throughout the project to engage the stakeholders at the appropriate formality, tempo, timing, and using the appropriate transmission mechanisms that will help you engage them and make sure that they are actively involved. And then obviously you're going to have to execute to that plan and manage change associated with that plan throughout the life cycle of the project. And what I mean by managing change is you need to update the stakeholder spreadsheet as appropriate throughout the project and change communication methods or add stakeholders or delete stakeholders as appropriate. So that is it takes effort. It takes much more effort at the front end, but actually if you take the time to do that, then throughout the project and at the end, you will see the results. Now, I mentioned before the measures of effectiveness and the outputs, the key performance parameters, and I want you to see that in a visualization here. As you're working through discussing, having conversations with your key stakeholders, take care during the stakeholder analysis to define in your conversations any measures of effectiveness. What does it mean when they see your project in its operational state? How does it work? What do they need to see out of that? Do they have any specific criteria that they're looking for? If they don't know, you can walk through a use case or a concept of operations and then identify their needs through that. And when I say use case or concept of operations, it's not complicated, but what you should do is ask them to describe in an operational state, in their perfect world, what the outcomes of this project look like, and document that. You'd be surprised how different their ideas are than what you have in your project plan. So this is a really interesting, important analysis to walk through each of your key stakeholders, identify what their vision looks like, and then make sure that you have that a vision aligned across your key stakeholders and within your project plan itself. You can develop your key performance parameters and document your stakeholder requirements, and that's going to be used all the way at the end of the project when you are validating the outcomes of your project. Now remember, verification of your outcomes means technically it does what technically you stated the project would do. Validation means that your customer, your client, your sponsor agrees that what you gave them is what they need, even if it's not what they identified at the beginning of the project, because you have accurately defined their needs and you have managed change carefully that they haven't been involved with the entire time throughout the project, and they are satisfied with the outcomes of the project. If you have a clear set of measures of effectiveness and key performance parameters and validation criteria that you have defined and agreed upon with your customer, client, sponsor, etc., then your risks can be radically reduced on the project, and you can expect and have a pretty comfortable idea that you will end that project in a good place. So, I really recommend that your engagement with your stakeholders includes this really key analysis. Now, remember that project management methods that you use are going to impact your stakeholder involvement. I've popped in a little model for you to use here, and I'd like to encourage you to remember that the project management method will impact your stakeholder involvement. And there's a few ways to think about this. Projects that accept a lot of change out of cycle, have a low architectural design maturity. They're moving at a slower tempo. They have a high need or a low need for user involvement during development. This is all going to impact your approach. And I've shown here some of the most typical types of project management methods. Some you may be very familiar with, like Agile or just PLM, just the product lifecycle management kind of methodologies, which are more like the traditional waterfall method. They're going to drive how often you meet with your stakeholders. I do want to caution you that projects can have multiple uses of project management methodologies within them. And that is definitely teased out during the work breakdown phase when you're looking at, do I have an element of my project that I know how to do, that's traditional, that's going to use very standard project management method, waterfall method. It's a known quantity. I just need to replicate it. And that could be in addition to a software development project where you do not know what that is going to look like, and you're going to need to engage in the stakeholders different ways. So I strongly suggest, as you're working through your project management planning, as you're building out your work breakdown structure and your schedule, that you identify the project management method that you're going to use. I've mentioned this before. I've showed you a little brief version of this, but in non-human readable form. Maybe you can read this one better. The tools are simple. However, as I mentioned before, the work that is put into the identification and analysis of the stakeholders will be value added, guaranteed. The real value of the effort put into this will be demonstrated at the end of the project when the key stakeholders effortlessly accept the outcomes of your project. I've put in some templated material for you so you could see how you might fill this out. But it really is very open to what works for you within your own organization. So feel free to replicate this in your own project if you don't already have a good template and a tool to use. Now, as we move forward into the Q&A, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about this presentation. Thank you again for your time today. I know your time is valuable. I appreciate your participation. Hopefully, you found it interesting and thought-provoking. And that concludes the presentation. At this point, I'm going to hand the question and answer session off to Susan, who will field questions from you.
Do you have any tips or tricks for interacting with stakeholders who are resistive?
That's a good one. And that, I think we all have those at some point or another. I think those in a sense are more important, especially if they have a lot of influence. So I would say if you have any resistant stakeholders, especially if they're key, you have to spend a lot of time upfront right away trying to understand their position. Why are they resistant? Sometimes giving them a voice is all you need to do. You know, they feel heard, they feel understood if you give them a voice and you interact with them. So I'm always cautious for those stakeholders that are resistant and have a lot of influence, even if it's informal influence, because they are the ones that can truly derail a project. So meet with them first, meet with them and get their listen. Make sure that you understand what it is, why they're resistant, determine if they truly are, if they are not influential and they're resistant and they don't play a big role, you must actually um, just move on, accept that, and just say, you know, I'm not going to be able to change this person's mind, but they're not influencing and they're not a part of the project per se. So that is a good way to handle that. I would suggest early and in-depth discussion with a lot of time for them to tell you their opinion. Thank you for the question.
Great, thank you, Lory. We did have another question pop up. What are your tips on tailoring this approach to smaller projects? Do you only utilize certain tools?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I always caution, you know, people think it's a small project, so therefore I shouldn't have to spend as much time on a process in preparation. But I will caution that sometimes the small projects are the harder projects. You have a smaller cadre of stakeholders. And so I think that identifying your key stakeholders, you might only have um, 5, or you might have 2, or you might have 1. But investing in going ahead and documenting that process, documenting who your stakeholders are and what their needs are is still going to be incredibly valuable, because the smaller the project is, the more important it may be to have their buy-in and their absolute support. Great questions.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Lory. And Belinda replied, agree, especially if they are very vocal and are influential.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Lory, we thank you so much for presenting today.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.